Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara Meneghini, and I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about Claude Debussy and his music La Mer, or The Sea. As you are preparing to listen to the music as part of the Colorado Music Festival Summer Season 2023 at Chautauqua. I'm going to share with you a few things that I've learned through reading a little bit more about Debussy and particularly about La Mer, and some things that I think would be helpful to know before you go to the concert. Now, Claude Debussy's La Mer, or The Sea, was never intended to be a direct portrait of the sea. I think this is important because sometimes we expect a piece of music to have a story, to have a program, to have a through line. And his music in this concert isn't necessarily intended to do just that. For a brief period of time in his life, he was a music critic, and he would critique colleagues of his own in their pieces. And he might say, something like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony or Strauss's Tone Poem had more of a story to it. It required a program. But instead, Debussy's La Mer takes us into a deep world of atmosphere, of senses, of metaphor, and of synesthesia, which is a blurring of all five of our senses at the same time. So think of the last time you were by a body of water, or maybe you can imagine being by a body of water that maybe you haven't visited before, because it's just as powerful in your imagination as Debussy also was to have said. So imagine, if you will, the shimmering colors on the water and all the multitude of colors. There's not just one color, because the color is dancing in these tiny little droplets of water, those little prisms. So there's lots of color merging on the water. The movement of the water in a dance of fluidity and flow, whether that's quick or slow, but the movement is constantly doing a little something. The motion blends together. The motion, the dancing of the light, the sound, the smell, the feeling, all of those things come together in an ever-changing soundscape, or we might think of it as a landscape, which Debussy took these soundscapes that he saw or he imagined, and he transformed them into sound, as with the sea. It runs this gamut in sensation and feeling, from serene, or it can even be quiet at times, to terrifying or awe-inspiring power and sound. He finished the work, which he subtitled 3 Symphonic Sketches, in March of 1905 at the Grand Hotel at Eastbourne on the coast of the English Channel. A location he described to his publisher as a charming, peaceful spot where the sea unfurls itself with an utterly British correctness. I had to get that correct. But most of the composition of La Mer was not done by the water at all. It was done away from the water. In a published review of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, the composer wrote that music should not attempt at direct imitation, but rather capture the invisible sentiments of nature. See, the difference between Debussy and his contemporaries of the time period was that he drew more inspiration from depictions of the sea, depictions in poetry, in paintings, in literature, than actually being seaside, experiencing the seawater and the air and the light. He imagined it and experienced it through these fellow artists that were writing and painting and creating poetry about. For the cover of the score, Debussy chose the wood block print by the Japanese artist Hokusai, the Great Wave, which influenced French painters all over, including Monet and Degas. See, Debussy called distant childhood memories of summers spent by the sea worth more than any reality. I'd have to say I might agree with him. La Mer is filled with a sense of the intangible and ephemeral. We experience the music as this broad, unfolding musical stream of consciousness in which motives evolved with an organic, self-organizing perfection. All of this suggests an inherent lack of formal structure. Debussy, he rejected the musical status quo of the time, and this was fueled largely by his jealous love of other art forms. He loved painting and poetry. For him, music was just a lesser art form. Now, I have to say, when I was reading about this, I certainly understand. I am primarily a live theater artist. And with the advent of all things digital and remote, I certainly can feel that way about my art form at some time. So Debussy thought the music was a lesser art form of the period, and it was falling behind these other forms. To him, music had nothing like the free verse of poetry or a drift in abstraction in painting that Monet, Degas were experiencing in that time period, and the, quote, investigation of mystical spheres that was happening across the arts, unquote, he said. It was definitely poetry and painting that inspired Debussy's early breakthroughs. He was born in 1862 in Paris to a very poor family. His father had a string of odd jobs and eventually was in jail for a period of time. And his mother was a seamstress. And through a series of fortunate events and connections that his father had with music teachers, Debussy was invited to attend the Paris Conservatory in 1872 when he was only 10 years old. At the conservatory, it was noticed that he was a restless child, a restless student, considering he always asked questions about the fundamentals of musical form. Why were those systems needed, after all, he thought? Well, he mastered the academic exercises required of him at the conservatory. He never stopped questioning the so-called rules of music of the time. Old forms, he felt, dissolved so that moods and textures and sensations might emerge. Perhaps Debussy's central insight, it is said, was about the constricting effect of the standard major and minor scales. He had a fondness for the full spectrum of sounds, the natural harmonic series, and overtones. You see, those notes that exist outside the construct of standard major minor scales. Why not use differently arranged and tuned scales? This was rather unheard of at the time. Why not use those scales and sounds found outside of Western culture tradition? In La Mer, you'll hear the Eastern sounds of a Javanese gamelan, which had captured the imagination of Parisians at the 1889 Paris Exposition. Instead of the heavy kind of pull of a conventional major or minor scale, Debussy's music seems to float into a different world. It takes us somewhere else than the tangible. In many ways, his music still sounds modern to us today, so it isn't surprising that the first audience of La Mer left the concert hall baffled They weren't quite sure what they had experienced. They were unable to fully grasp this rather revolutionary and transformative sound written by who would become one of music history's greatest rule breakers. Claude Debussy died more than a century ago. But you know, his music has in no way grown old. Rather, it is said to have rather a sensation of floating in time. It appears to be improvising itself into being, which is exactly what Debussy wanted, the effect he wanted. And as an actor, I can totally relate to this. Even though we rehearse and rehearse and rehearse something, when we get up there on stage, we want the audience to feel like it's the very first time this person has experienced that thing. Well, that's what Debussy wanted his music to sound like to the listener. He is known to have said after a rehearsal of one of his other orchestral suites, quote, "This has the air of not ever having been written down," unquote. And in a conversation with one of his former teachers, he said, "There is no theory to my music. You merely have to listen to my music. Pleasure is the law." Many say that these qualities, these values in his compositions befit a person who valued greatly beautiful things, including art. He loved different kinds of art. He loved painting. He loved poetry. He loved literature. There's a great New Yorker article that I found when I was preparing these notes for you. It's called The Velvet Revolution of Claude Debussy: How a Reclusive Frenchman Created Some of the Most Radical, Beautiful Music of the Modern Era, written by Alex Ross. Now, Ross writes that Debussy may have been the first composer in history to become a fully modern-minded artist. That is to say that he was joining a community of artists, of writers, of painters, of poets. They were borrowing ideas from each other, lending each other an idea. Debussy would borrow a sensation that was evoked from a painting he saw of Monet. And Monet then in turn would allow his painting to emerge from listening to one of Debussy's compositions. It's important to note Debussy's connection to these other art forms, as well as wonder about how much they inspired and influenced his own connections. We talk a lot about the influence of art in our own lives, in what we create. And here is an artist in Debussy that allowed the power of a painting, a poem, a story to influence his own compositions. He saw, he read, he pondered, he transformed what he experienced in others' art into sound, into music. This is part of the reason that his music is so easy to love, but oftentimes it's really hard to explain. When you listen to La Mer, and you leave Chautauqua and you're walking away, you might not be able to explain what you heard, but I bet you feel something. He brought a new kind of beauty to the world in a large respect. His language of music was different. It wasn't shocking, though. It didn't cause scandal. It was immediately accepted by the public. Almost everyone just loved it immediately. Ross, in this New Yorker article, he says that Debussy engineered a velvet revolution, overturning the extant order without upheaval. Now, the last time I heard something about a velvet revolution in sound was a featured story about Adele's voice and what her voice tends to do to people because of the intervals at which she lands a particular phrase or note. His influence is so vast, not only in the world of classical music, but also in jazz, in popular music. I can easily say in theater. And his music has become a Hollywood favorite of sorts as a soundtrack for movies. In fact, if we consider Debussy's music with our cinematic senses, there was a study that was done of La Mer by a music scholar, Simon Treases, and he offered that the music of La Mer is a complexly layered conception in which foreground and background merge. That's kind of a cool thing to think about. And I go back to this word synesthesia, that blurring of the senses, that vortex of being in the now, in the moment, feeling like what you are experiencing hasn't been planned out or even scored, if you will. It's alive, it's in me, it's happening right now. As you listen to La Mer, consider the sensations that emerge in you. The first movement, from dawn to noon on the sea. It gradually awakens, emerging out of mystery, maybe darkness, maybe the temperature is cooler. The second movement, play of the waves, it's a little bit more giddy, a scherzo filled with playful, feels like splashes of the water, of light, of color, of temperature. And in the final movement, dialogue of the wind and the sea. So it's a give and take, the wind and the sea, a dialogue. Evokes this awe and wonder, this power of the sea. And we're confronted with it as the motives from the first movement return to that third movement and are interwoven into that music again. Debussy's biographer, Oscar Thompson, wrote a nice poetic description of La Mer that I'd like to share with you as I close today and leave you to listen. Thompson says, La Mer, a world of sheer fantasy, of strange visions and eerie voices, a mirage of sight and equally a mirage of sound. On the sea's vast stage is presented trance-like phantasmagoria so effervescent and fugitive that it leaves behind only the vagueness of a dream. I would have to say that is a fine description of the piece you're going to hear today. La Mer provides an experience, something ultimate, transcending, simultaneously triumphant and beautiful. Now, after having shared this information with you and this digging a little bit deeper into the piece in Debussy, I invite you to forget all of it. Close your eyes, and as Debussy would say, listen. Thank you.